I think one of the main things that has always been inspiring to me is coming from an activist background, being someone being Palestinian, and that's something that's always part of who you are. So that comes into a lot of the work and the way that I approach design. I'm very interested in ideas of how people can connect these academic concepts to sort of on the ground. So kind of in layman terms, where they can explain things in layman terms so people get it rather than living in this sort of very abstract space. So I think that for me, coming across people who can do that is one of the most inspiring things for when I'm reading or how I'm going to be approaching my work. I think that was that exposure from a very young age of not just going to protest, but Palestine always being something that you discussed in the house, and that obviously was very much part of who you were, and not just culturally, it was also politically, right? Because there's ways of being a Palestinian that are, for some people just completely cultural, whereas in my household there was that balancing act. And yeah, and it was also kind of being able to visit Palestine when first time was I was 14. It was Oslo Agreement at that point. It was right before the Second Intifada, and that was in 2000. Um, and just seeing it and just kind of experiencing it and understanding that, putting it into perspective, what you grew up with, and then having gone again in 2002 during the Second Intifada, which was I was 16 years old, and experiencing very much what, as a Palestinian diaspora, your experience is very different from what people on the ground are experiencing, obviously. But living in the Hisha refugee camp at the time, and just basically going through everything they went through. So things like a bulldozer just running through the neighborhood at 4 a.m. just to disrupt your sleep, having to kind of duck in certain areas when the Israeli occupation forces were coming in to uh, demolish someone's home. So that made it very, very real, that kind of lived experience, right? And then having gone in 2010, where things were quite different, but at that point being older and in my 20s and engaging with a lot of the young people that were in university at the time and understanding their experiences. And that led me to launch a magazine. So that was always kind of something that has influenced a lot of the ideas and work that I do. I think it's a difficult thing because you're not always going to be able to achieve that goal, but you can aim to do it in one way or another. In terms of academic work, it's really about, obviously you have certain requirements in terms of in a career where you have to publish in what ways, etc. But that doesn't prevent you from taking that knowledge and looking at different outlets where people will come across your ideas in a way that is more written in terms that are more comprehensible to people, rather than kind of jargon infused academic writing that you have. So that's one way I try to do that with. And design, you're kind of in a different space because there is very much that tie to practice. It's not necessarily an academic discipline, as say, in a traditional sense, such as like anthropology or political science or all of these things. So that is an advantage to a lot of us. That's not saying that people necessarily do that. And I think also design tends to be very much talking about, they don't really understand how to articulate the value of what they do. They see it very much within that, very traditional confines of design. I think some of the ways that we actually exhibit work can be quite effective. However, it's also location and understanding the audience. We talk a lot about audience and users in design, and particularly in communication design. But it's amazing how little people understand it, or that it's actually taught. And so you end up kind of disseminating things for an audience that speaks a very similar language to yours, and so on and so forth. So I think those are one of the key ways, is who's my audience? What is the most effective way? Generally designers, artists always think an exhibition is the best way to go, but is it really? How do you utilize your tools where it's not necessarily I'm very interested in this idea that it's not necessarily about the outcome being a designed thing, but that you as a designer are kind of working within the process where design feeds into what may become the outcome, but isn't necessarily the final outcome. Because again, you're thinking in very sort of specific terms, like it's going to be a publication, it's going to be an exhibition. And in some cases, that is 100% what it needs to be. But in other cases, it's not necessarily what it needs to be. So it's that idea of working in different teams and being able to communicate within different teams. And that's the way that you start to kind of amplify this knowledge and spread it across borders. I think this question kind of spans a bit outside of design because the representation is largely one of the media. I think design and art is sort of this secondary element where we then self-orientalize and fulfill designs that is wanted by specific parts of the world, like the arabesque patterns and these kind of geometry, which of course are a huge part of, say, Islamic culture, which is almost de facto Arab culture because of the mixing. But it is by no means the only thing. And at the same time, it's okay, how do you kind of grow from that? Because a lot of people making this work are also not actually living within the Arab region. They're kind of from different spaces. But that's what the West seems to kind of look at. I think in terms to counter this one is very difficult because the past 7 months have shown us how much you have progress and then very easily you kind of go back like, I don't know, 15 years. For me right now, very much feels like when I was 14, 15 years old during September 11th, where things were just like, oh, okay, you are a terrorist. That's what you are. That's kind of that representation. And there's a really good documentary called Real Bad Arabs by Jack Shaheen, which shows the representation of Arabs in Hollywood cinema. And yet you still continue, even though there's more kind of representation now of different cultures, you still see these little elements, right? Because even then, if they're going to have an Arab character, that Arab character has to be completely what we would say whitewashed. And not saying that these characters don't exist, they of course do, but it feels like for them to be relatable, whether they're Indian, Chinese, Arab, they have to be kind of white in a way to be gauged by the audience watching something. And so I talk a little bit about this in terms of going back to design is designers tend to, well, the design world tends to cling on to particular type of designers who look a certain way, who speak a certain way, who design in a certain way that is kind of digestible to the West because they understand it has an aesthetic they completely understand, right? That this is like, okay, I call them the émigré designers. And I fall under that category as well, because I speak English. I'm very comfortable speaking English. You're usually more comfortable speaking a language like French or English than you are in Arabic. And you're not necessarily, you're living in the diaspora. And this is one of the issues that you see, because also, in a way, most people who are designers here are monolingual, right? So they're not going to read anything that's been written by a designer in Arabic, right? Plus also kind of you're looking at translation issues of hierarchy of journals, of dissemination of information, etc. So you get into a lot of other things. So I've just named a few areas where to kind of break these. I mean, I don't actually know how you can break the misrepresentation and stereotypes. I think for me, the last 7 months have shown how so incredibly dehumanized Arabs and Palestinians particularly are. So it feels like no matter how much you try to move forward, you're always gone a few steps back. But I guess maybe it's being attuned and understanding how this is happening, how that kind of media literacy and starting to comprehend how they do play a role in misrepresenting people, how these stereotypes do really hurt people and their perception of them. And because you're right, you just say overconsumption in social media. Now you have, I think people work in vertical reels and Instagram carousels, which basically remove all types of nuance from something. And your hope is that if there's something that is of interest that you come across in these platforms, then maybe you will research it some more. But unfortunately, you're living in an era where everything happens so much, right? There's just so much content to the point that, and I mean, we're all guilty of it. I can sometimes cannot remember where I encountered an idea because I've read, I don't know, I was scrolling through Instagram, I was scrolling through some newsletters, I was reading a book. And so it becomes very difficult to go back into my actual filing cabinet and know where this reference came from. So that's one of the effects of it, this overconsumption. Whereas if I look back at things that I engaged with when I was younger and up until maybe mid-20s, I can remember and pinpoint some moments in time when I came across a specific idea and where, right? I can't do that anymore. Decolonization, unfortunately, as a term, had the phase of when it started becoming more popular, it was very much dismissed. And then after the George Floyd murder, and everybody kind of started, these protests against injustice, and people started to come to, okay, what is this term? What does it mean by it? But I think that there was the danger of we condense, and particularly within design, I'm speaking within a design context, is that we tend to condense things into toolkits. Why? Because they're much easier to comprehend and engage with. And so we strip down that concept into a toolkit where it's like, if I follow these steps, I will accomplish decolonization. And I think that for many designers, to understand a toolkit has a specific context and is not a sort of Bible of sorts for you to just guide you through the process and through life, having that understanding that this is kind of a really long-term ongoing process. But how do you do that is very hard. I think some of us in the decolonizing design group have started to almost push away from the term because it's being conflated with terms like anti-racism, social justice, racial justice, climate justice, so that all these frameworks become one rather than having this larger understanding of it. So it becomes a equality, diversity, and inclusion type of work, which it's not, right? It's much different than that. I'm afraid I don't know. I think that it's good that there's more awareness of the term, but at the same time, it really has been co-opted. And I guess it's just a matter of doing that critical work and hoping that people really do actually engage with it, and try to understand it. But that's a very hard task. I mean, you start anew. You start to think about themes rather than disciplines. And I think that's, again, a very long-term project, but it's not just design. There's so many things that feed into design that, what if you what if you worked with theming a university rather than disciplining a university and then seeing how that works? Again, it's about iteration. It's about how you test these ideas out. But if you start to introduce them from the beginning of someone's education, then because right now we think in disciplines because that's how the world is constructed. So what happens if you sort of break that apart from the start? What type of things start to emerge? So the monograph, Design Otherwise, Transforming Design Education in the Arab Region, is based off of my PhD research, which I conducted over 5 years. And it's expanded, whereas the PhD was about Jordan as a case study, and now I've expanded it to cities like Beirut. So Amman is still kind of the main thing. So you have Beirut, Cairo, and Dubai. So the idea behind it uh, is to really center the voices of students, design educators, and designers who are working within the design field, and particularly in design education, and kind of bringing these ideas together. And what they see are the main challenges of making education more relevant to its local context. Why this is important is because a lot of these programs were kind of copy and pasted from different parts of the world, and so they're a bit disconnected from what's happening on the ground. Um, and it does show the generations of a lot of the people who've been interviewed are generally within kind of in my contemporaries, for example, a bit younger. And so there's a big shift from those educators and designers who came in and launched these programs maybe in the 80s, early 90s, where their goals were more about, okay, meeting the standard of the West, whereas the younger generation is thinking, actually, how do we build a design that makes more sense for what's going on here? It's not, the aim is not to be prescriptive. It's basically taking what they're saying and coming up with certain possibilities. So moments of possibility, what can be done to kind of make it more relevant to its local context, to increase the visibility and value of design within the region, and a sort of guidance rather than, again, a toolkit, is because the thing is that this is not effective until it's put into practice. And the whole argument is you put things into practice and you iterate them because you see what works and what doesn't. Now, remember, there's 4 different cities. Of course, they all have some similarities, but huge amounts of differences. And their education systems are quite different, but the most similar within kind of the region, because of course you're also missing a chunk here in North Africa. You're missing Iraq, which has some of the oldest art and design education. Syria, which is, still undergoing a civil war. Palestine, whole different context. So it's impossible to kind of, just say, here's 22, 23 Arab countries. This is all the same thing. So the idea is, here are bits of maybe things you can test out within your own context and see what works. So a look into the future. That's why I've called it moments of possibility rather than step 1, step 2, step 3. And that's, again, going back to the idea of decolonization being a toolkit. This is what I try really to not do in my work, is be prescriptive, right? Because it's all about trialing things and seeing how they work, how they don't work. But the whole goal of the piece of work is to say that knowledge comes from the people who are working on the ground, and these are their voices. This is what they're saying, and this is what they'd like to see. Well, this is becoming more and more difficult because of the way that institutions are moving towards becoming more about tuition paying, less support for research. I'm speaking particularly in the UK context, but I also know that there's huge waves of privatization of education around the world. And with private education, it's very different from public education. And you'll see that in the book, actually. There's a big difference between public education institutions and the private ones, and what their goals are. In the UK, over the last 15 years, the tuition fees have really kind of decimated education and what it's actually aimed to do. There's also this increased reliance on foreign students, which has always been something that you see in education, because also actually reliance on international students and staff is important to keep universities internationally competitive and bring in interesting research. But over the last decade, it's been about just money to maintain the courses and to maintain other BAs and to allow the home fees to stay at the 9,000. Then you had Brexit, which also caused a lot of exodus of European students. So you lost also that bit of internationalization, that exchange, etc. So it's hard because now you're looking at a model that is crumbling and it doesn't work, and there's no intervention from the government to do things otherwise, whether it's going back to how the model used to be, which people will say is not necessarily effective in this day and age. But also there's no thinking around what kind of model could work in order to enable these ideas within universities to thrive. You can look at the American and Canadian models, but as we've seen again in the last 7 months have been absolutely eye-opening for loads of people. Academic freedom, which is something that is kind of this uh, sacred for Americans, as they'll tell you, is completely a myth because people are losing their jobs speaking about Palestine, right? So how can you say you have academic freedom when all of these things are happening, right? People are being suspended for writing something that a dean doesn't like or a president doesn't like because these big private institutions are funded by someone else's money, and that person dictates what they like and they don't like. So if you want to break away from that the whole model has to change, right? That's one. But if that's the model to be kept, what is the agreement you have with the funder or a trustee or whatever it is? And again, the UK is quite different, doesn't work in quite the same way, but people's influence really it comes into play when you look at the type of research being produced, the type of things you can and can't say. Now we talk a lot about decolonizing the institution, and of course, decolonizing the university is not necessarily possible, but the university can cultivate an intellectual environment in which to discuss the widespread presence of coloniality. And right now, we're seeing that that's not happening, right? That's kind of being completely dismissed. People are worried. But I think that there's something about pushing, something about asking for new models rather than just sitting there and saying, okay, this is the way that it should be. And I think this is the moment for that. This is the moment for that because we're in fact seeing it in front of our eyes. No one is being secretive. I mean, you can look at what Germany's doing. You can look at what's happened in the US, in Canada, in bits UK a little bit less, but happening in other parts of Europe, other parts of the world. This kind of silencing is showing us that we need new models in order to be able to discuss these ideas and think about this plurality and this groundbreaking discourse. And maybe that is the moment that we'll see it happen because under these kind of very repressive conditions, um, some of the most creative work tends to happen. So I think that's my response to that one. But again, all of it is a very long-term project. Well, I've recently been appointed as a reader and associate professor at Decolonizing the Arts Institute. So it's been kind of seeing how we can grow the institute in different ways and um, just working on specific grant projects to connect communication design with more day-to-day publics and communities here in London. And yeah, that's kind of what's on my mind, and that's what I'm going to be looking at next. And of course, the book launch, which very excited about.